Hello students, this is your review for the exam on part 3 of federal government. Of course, you know that our government is bicameral. That means it has two parts. And senators are elected only a third of them at a time in order to maintain a consistency in the government, and also to insulate Congress and the government from the pressures of individual or narrow concerns or just transient concerns. The frequency which the House of Representatives is elected, which is every 2 years, makes it more responsive theoretically to the government, to the people. And that has to be considered, though, in the light of what's called redistricting and gerrymandering that goes on during redistricting, whereby the majority in a state legislature or in a commission that is charged with drawing districts after each census, which is every 10 years, tends to favor their party in drawing the lines. They like to see their candidates win, so they use computer programs and such to draw lines that favor their candidates of their party, called gerrymandering. And a major risk of delegates model in representation is that the voices of only a few active and informed constituents get heard. The first female Speaker of the House of Representatives was Nancy Pelosi. Representation of women in Congress has increased over the last couple of decades, but it's still well below the equivalency to the male representation in Congress. Most members of Congress are, guess what? Lawyers. Congressmen often get involved in helping their constituents solve problems with the government. Maybe you filed a claim and it's been a long time, you haven't heard anything, you can't seem to get an answer from the agency, so you call your congressman. That's the work that I did for Congressman Bob Eckhart. I worked for him for about 8 to 10 years, and that's what I did. Okay, that was a while back. When a congressman is running for, or even a senator is running for re-election, he's called an incumbent. And his election is called an incumbency because he holds the office now. There is what's called a sophomore surge. That is, once a member gets elected to Congress, he or she tends to get re-elected. It's easier to get re-elected than to get elected your first time. In fact, the fact is, at this time in history, the overwhelming members of Congress get re-elected every election. It's hard to beat an incumbent member of the Senate or the House. One reason is they have access to what's called pork barrel legislation, which is appropriations made to favor a particular project or a particular district of a member of Congress. The number of seats in the House of Representatives is 435. That is not set by the Constitution, that's set by Congress, and it was set in 1929 and has never changed. So whenever there is a census, then this 435 members or seats in the House of Representatives is reallocated. It's called apportionment. And states that have gained in population get more representation in the House of Representatives. Those that have not gained too much or even lost population actually lose members of Congress. They have seats taken away from them if their population has not grown as fast as other states. The winners in recent years has been the South and the West in the reapportionment or apportionment process. That's where the growth in population has been, in the South and in the West. And of course, after the apportionment is made, the local legislatures of the various states, or whatever commission or however they draw their congressional lines, there's a lot of what's called gerrymandering that goes on, which means that the majority party gets to draw the lines, and they draw them to favor their candidates. You can move around the lines so that more members of your party get put into more districts than otherwise would be the case. In other words, if you're a member of the majority party, you don't want a whole lot of members of your party, voters who tend to vote for your party, all in a handful of congressional districts. You want to spread them out and put some of them in other districts. And that's called gerrymandering, or gerrymandering sometimes it's called, because it was named after a governor of Massachusetts named Eldridge Gerry. That was back in the early 1800s. And he's the one who first discovered the wonder of manipulating the legislative lines to favor your party. And so it took his name from the process took its name from his last name. Okay, the Supreme Court has heard cases on gerrymandering or gerrymandering, and they've decided that, hey, they're not going to get into it. They say it's a political question and it's not appropriate for them to decide. So they have taken a hands-off approach to the process. The Speaker of the House is elected by the majority members of the House of Representatives, and then they also elect what's called a majority leader, which is a different individual who is sort of the leader of the party, but the Speaker of the House is the real leader and is superior to the majority leader. In the Senate, the real power is in the majority leader and, surprisingly, the minority leader, because the minority leader's in the position to block a lot of legislation that he or she does not like. In fact, in both the House and in the Senate, the leaders in the House, as the Speaker of the House, nothing comes even for a vote in either the House of Representatives or the Senate without the leadership agreeing to bring it to a vote. So even if a majority of the members of the House or a majority of the members of the Senate are in favor of a particular piece of legislation, it's not going to get voted on unless the party leader, at least the majority party leader, wants it to be voted on. And the minority leader decides not to block it in some way. Otherwise, it just doesn't get voted on. There are what's called standing committees in the House and in the Senate, and it's defined by subject matter legislation which often parallels government agencies. For example, there is a Agriculture Committee, which, guess what? Their jurisdiction is over proposed legislation that has to do with agriculture. And it has mainly to do with the Department of Agriculture. So these are called standing committees. And they are in existence year after year, term after term of the Congress. They're always there. In the House, one of the most powerful committees is what's called the House Ways and Means Committee. They have jurisdiction over things like taxes, trade, and entitlement programs. You will recall that the Constitution says that all revenue bills have to originate in the House of Representatives. So this is the committee where they originate. This is the taxing committee, the Ways and Means Committee. It's named because they had to find the ways and means to raise money. And the way is taxes, tariffs, other duties, fees, that sort of thing. They really control the gathering of the money to run the federal government. And of course, the working hand in hand with them is the Appropriations Committee. Okay, now by custom, the House has to originate appropriations bills also. It was decided at some point in history that because the House has to originate revenue bills, they should also, and that's required by the Constitution, but by custom, they also originate appropriations bill. That's not in the Constitution. It's just by custom because they are in charge of taxes. So why shouldn't they also be in charge of appropriations? And of course, all committees have what's called subcommittees. For example, the Judiciary Committee has a subcommittee, as an example, for immigration, and they specialize in legislation concerning immigration. That's just an example. Okay, when two bills pass the House and the Senate, but they are different, there has to be a reconciliation of the two. They form what's called a conference committee, which is made up of members of the House and the Senate appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate in cooperation with the minority leaders, and they get together and they have to work out the differences in the bills, because every bill has to be approved by both the House and the Senate in exactly the same form. Every period, every comma, everything has to be exactly the same before it can then be sent to the president for his or her actions, either veto or sign it. The Congress has a Congressional Budget Office that helps them figure out how much bills are going to cost. Whenever Congress is considering a particular bill that involves money, which almost all bills do, they will send a copy of it to the Congressional Budget Office for an estimate as to how much this bill is going to cost or save the government. Sometimes bills save money. Okay, and so that's called the Congressional Budget Office, and they are the number crunchers for Congress, and they figure out for Congress what the impact of legislation is going to be on the budget. A proposed law, of course, is called a bill. Bills are considered by congressional committees, and when they get down to the final stage of considering a bill, they have what's called a markup session. That is where the committee actually sits down with pencils and erasers or what have you, and they work out every paragraph, every sentence, every word in the proposed bill, so that it comes out of the committee in final form. We know that the Senate this time has a filibuster rule which requires that in most cases, for most bills, it requires 3/5 of the senators to vote to consider the bill. Even to consider it, you have to have 3/5, which happens to be 60 at this time. 3/5 of 100 senators is 60. And so you have to have 60 senators in agreement that they will agree to vote on a bill. Okay, there's a few ways around that. One is called what's called reconciliation. If the proposed legislation involves the budget, then it does not require 60 votes in order to consider it. It does not require 60 votes in order to pass it. It requires only a majority. And that's called reconciliation. And it's been used many times, or a number of times, I should say, by the Senate to get legislation passed where the Senate could not, the proposers of the legislation could not get 60 votes for it. So the filibuster allows allows the Senate to a minority of the Senate to block even consideration of a bill, and it's become increasingly difficult to get any bills passed because the Senate has become in recent years very closely divided between the two parties. Sometimes they invoke what's called a nuclear option. They did this in 2013. They essentially altered the filibuster rule to say, okay, it does not apply in the case of confirming judges to the court or administrative appointments. So it does not require 60 votes to confirm the appointment of a judge to the federal bench or to confirm a cabinet secretary, such as the Attorney General or the Secretary of State or Secretary of Transportation or what have you. Does not require 60 votes. Okay. And of course, the term applied to the amount that Congress determines each agency should have is called appropriations. That's why you have Appropriations Committee. Okay, the office of the Presidency is established by Article 2 of the Constitution. Congress, in a number of cases, have delegated their powers to the President. For example, the President has enormous emergency powers that he or she can invoke to do things that would normally require an act of Congress. For example, particularly in wartime, where the President wants to move funds from one agency to another agency because of a war effort, or maybe it's not a declared war because, hey, we have not had a declared war since World War II. All of the other things like Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, all of these have been have not been declared wars. They certainly have had all the characteristics of a war, but they've essentially been just executive actions. The President can, the Congress, in addition, the Congress has certain express powers found in Article 8 of the Constitution of Section Article 1 and Article 2. Congress has certain expressed powers that they can exercise. The President can enter into executive agreements to avoid the treaty ratification process, particularly if the President is if his or her party is not in control in the Senate, then it would be hard for him or her to get a treaty approved by the Senate. So they reach what's called an executive agreement, which is like sort of a handshake agreement. If the president vetoes a piece of legislation, it can be overridden by Congress by a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress. This one of the most famous ones, or notable ones, I shouldn't say famous, but one of the notable instances of that is the Freedom of Information Act, which allows individuals to get copies of almost everything pertaining to them with any federal agency. So if you think you have a record, well, everyone has a record, like with a Social Security agency, Social Security Department. You also have a record with Internal Revenue Service. You may also have an FBI record if you've ever been a witness or you've been a subject of an investigation. There's a record, and you can get a copy of it so long as there's not still an investigation ongoing. You can get a copy of it. Now, they do redact, which means they black out sections of what they give you because they don't want you to have certain sensitive information. It's called Freedom of Information Act, and it's very, very helpful to people doing work like what I do, immigration work. Because when we have a client come in and he or she has had some dealings with immigration in the past, we want a copy of it. And so we have them sign some permission papers, and we ask immigration to give us copies of what is in his or her file. Okay, this piece of legislation was vetoed by President Gerald Ford, who was the successor to Richard Nixon. After Richard Nixon resigned, being the only president who has ever resigned from the office. When he resigned, his vice president, of course, became president. That was Gerald Ford, and he was the person who vetoed that bill. But it was overridden by Congress, so Freedom of Information Act is still there. It does exist. The president has certain inherent powers of the presidency. For example, particularly in wartime, when Fort Sumter fell at the beginning of the Civil War, President Lincoln ordered the army to go and defend the fort, or to take it back. But he did not have congressional authority to do that. But it was like an inherent power. In the 1950s, when there was a dispute over desegregating a high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, President Eisenhower used the executive order to order the National Guard to protect the African American students who had a court order from a federal court saying that they could go to the formerly all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And he was using his inherent executive powers to do that. The cabinet is the name given to the collection of departments and the secretaries of those departments, called the President's Cabinet. Cabinet members are nominated by the President, but they have to be approved or confirmed by the Senate. The President has a staff of advisors. They are referred to as the White House staff. And the President has an Office of Management and Budget, which are the President's number crunchers to determine what what legislation is going to save the government money and what's going to cost and how much it's going to cost, the Office of Management and Budget. The President has the power to issue executive orders ordering the agencies of the government to do certain things in certain ways. And recently, the number of executive orders has increased dramatically. And of course, agencies can enforce their regulations. For example, in 2015, when it was discovered by the Environmental Protection Agency that Volkswagen was cheating on their emissions mechanism, that it was loaded to show that Volkswagens were emitting less pollutants than they really were. The agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, disciplined them. They issued them orders and fines and so forth. That was an example of enforcement. And very often the government will do what's called privatization. An example of that would be when the government hires private companies to imprison people. They have a contract with the Justice Department, for example, to serve as halfway houses or prisons for nonviolent criminals. And it's called privatization because it's done by a private company with a government contract. Congress designed inspector generals in order to be nonpartisan sort of watchdogs over federal agencies. So every federal agency has an office of the inspector general, so that someone says that there's something, irregular or some hanky-panky going on in the agency, the inspector general can, on his or her own, investigate, and nobody can keep him from doing that, him or her. Okay, that is the end of your exam. Remember, you must do the exam on your own. You cannot have any assistance during the exam, and it is timed, so once you start it, you have to finish it. You can't take breaks. The questions, the exam is 50 questions. Almost all are multiple choice. You don't have any essay questions there. Okay, so thank you very much for watching, and good luck on your exam.